welcome to our first workshop of the semester featuring data visualization, GIS, and JavaScript. So we'll be exploring some basic web development using the JavaScript library Leaflet, and we're going to be making calls to the Where the ISS at API. We'll then be making an interactive map that shows the real-time location of the International Space Station. And by the end of the lesson, you will hopefully understand how to write some basic code in JavaScript and HTML, as well as how you can use API data to produce a really cool geospatial visualization. So we're going to be using the online editor JS Fiddle for this lesson, which thankfully doesn't require any sort of downloading. So at this time, if everyone has, whoever has made an account already, you can go ahead and log on to that. If you haven't made an account, that is totally okay. You can always make one later if you ever want to continue and make future web development projects. So I'll be sending a link shortly in the chat that takes you to the DSC GitHub page. So let me go ahead and do that for everyone. Right, and over here is, if you scroll down, it'll take you over to workshop 4. Here we have the attendee version, which is the version that we're going to be working on together. We also have a completely filled out copy. So if you ever get stuck at any point, you can definitely use this to refer to the completely filled out code. We also have a really cool cheat sheet. So other than the amazing aesthetic, it has explanations of pretty much all the technical concepts that we're going to cover, as well as a snippet of code that kind of shows you guys how that works. So if you want to follow along with the attendee copy, you can just click on this link over here, and it will take you to a page that looks very similar to this. So if you click on the fork button from there, it will basically let you create your own version. And I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to get there. If anyone has any sort of questions, feel free to email us. If it's a really quick question, you can also just unmute. But I'll just give you all a quick minute to get to this page. While everyone is getting to the JS Fiddle page, a quick tip which I wanted to mention: try not to have too many tabs of the code open at once. So if you have the attendee copy and the instructor copy, you might want to just be a little bit careful with that, because we're going to be dealing with an API. There's a rate limit factor, and that might, it could mess with that if we have too many tabs open at once. It should be okay though, no worries, but just a quick tip. Yeah, so for those of you all who want to know a little bit about what rate limit is, it's basically the amount of calls that you're making to the API for a given amount of time. So with certain projects, it wouldn't matter too much, but usually if you're making a ton of calls at once during a time period, that will cause some errors and some issues when loading everything. So that's why we need to be a little careful with that. Okay, so hopefully we are good to go. And so the first thing that we're going to do is get data from an external API. And API stands for Application Programming Interface. And the main thing that we want to understand from it is that it really involves two computer programs that essentially send information back and forth. So let's say I have an image database and I want to be able to let other kinds of applications have access to the images in my database. That would be a really good example for where we can use an API. So for this, we're going to be using a function called fetch, and that has the API URL inside it. So if you scroll down, you should have access to a variable that says API URL. That's what we're going to be using for this project. And we're going to be putting it inside of this fetch function. We'll be taking this data from a website called Where the ISS at over here. And in a moment, I'll show you what the website is and just some of the other cool features that it has. But for the purposes of this project, it's going to be giving you the current latitude and longitude of the ISS. It has a bunch of other information like altitude and velocity, but for this project, only the latitude and longitude are necessary. If you ever want to extend this project, you can definitely incorporate some of those other features. So we'll also be working with JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is just a readable format for extracting data. So we have the API URL that we need in our code, but really quickly, I'd like to show you guys just kind of how where the ISS at works. So here we have kind of a depiction of this marker that's showing where the ISS space station is at right now. And if we scroll down to where it says API over here, we can see kind of how the file and how the documentation looks like. It has stuff like latitude, longitude, altitude, velocity, visibility, all kinds of cool stuff, which you can definitely add in your project at some point. But that's just basically how that looks like. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating a function. And this function is basically going to have a bunch of commands, which we'll be running to extract the data from an API, the latitude and longitude data, and be able to use that for our map. So let's go ahead. And if you notice, we have comments up above. The thing that says to do, create get ISS function here, this is where we want to start coding. So directly underneath the comment is where we want to start coding. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to say async. We're going to say async function, and we're going to call it get ISS, just like what the comment mentions. And this will make the code easier to read. So what we'll do is we'll add some brackets over here. And the reason why we're using an async function, async stands for asynchronous. And the reason why we want to use it is so we can use this certain keyword called await. So we're going to be using a word in our function called await, and this will let our function work with JSON data. So we have this variable, global variable called API URL that has the URL stored, and that's set to the URL we need, and we just need to put it inside that fetch function. So to do that, the way we're going to do that is we're going to say const, which stands for a constant variable, and we're going to say const response equals await, and then we'll say fetch, which is the name of the function that we'll be calling, and we're going to say API URL. So now that we do that, just make sure it matches up with the variable that you have on top. In JavaScript, it is case sensitive, so it's important that you write the exact same thing inside whenever you're calling that variable. And since we only want to extract the latitude and the longitude, the way we want to do that is we just say const again for the variable, and we're going to call it data this time, and set that equal to, we're going to set that first equal to await response .json. That's just letting it know that it's going to be looking for a response using the JSON format. And for the actual extraction of the latitude and longitude, we're going to say const bracket and then say latitude, comma, longitude. And then we're going to set that equal to our data, which is the variable we just made over here. All right, so that's basically the first part of our function. The last thing we're going to do is we're just going to see, do we have a function call somewhere? Yes, we do. So this get ISS line over here, that essentially makes a call to the function. So when you write this line, get ISS, it's basically calling all of the lines that we've written over here. So that's how that works. And one cool thing about JS Fiddle is you actually have this feature called tidy. So if you click on this, it just formats your code to be a lot more readable, fix some of the alignment and indentation just to make your code a lot nicer. Okay.
Aria,
so, yes.
Can you just kind of hover over that function that we filled in so far and just take a sec to explain kind of what each bit is doing, and that way we have a little bit of time for people to fill in case they didn't get it.
Yes, of course. So this first part is our function name. And yes, so we have our function name. Here's where we're using the await fetch. So this fetch is fetching the API URL over here, and it's basically doing that. So it's looking for a response. So this API URL is where we're going to get our updating latitude and longitude. So this fetch is really important because it updates that and makes sure that we are going to get some sort of response. And data is very specific to, this line is very specific because we're working with JSON data. So this await keyword, we're saying await response.json because we want it to update and we want it to be done in that JSON data file format. And then const latitude longitude, remember how in our where the ISS at documentation, we had a whole bunch of other parameters. So the reason why we're specifying latitude and longitude is that's mainly what we're going to be using to map where the ISS location is. Definitely at a later time, you can include more of those parameters, but for now, we're just going to stick with latitude and longitude. So that's basically how that function works. If anyone has any sort of questions, please feel free to email us, or if you have a question, you can unmute or use the chat. And yes, I think Amelia mentioned in the chat. So do make sure to kind of copy the exact wording, and you can also refer to the completed example just to make sure there are no typos or any other spelling errors, just because one spelling error can cause errors in the program since it is all case sensitive in JavaScript.
Arya, could you Arya, could you explain what a function is and why I might use them if I'm coding?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So functions are a really nice way to hold a bunch of commands together. So in programming, when you're writing a bunch of lines of code, what that does is it helps you so that those lines of code are sort of organized and they can do some sort of action for you. So if you have all of these lines of code and you want to put it together and you want to run that, so that way you want to do a specific task. So in this case, we want it to get the ISS data. A function kind of puts all of that together and lets you execute it in a way that you can perform that action. So in general, functions are really useful in coding, just so everything is a lot more organized. And when you call those specific functions, you know that all of those associated lines that are inside of those brackets over here are going to run as part of that function. Yeah, good question. If anyone else has any sort of questions about any of the topics that I'm talking about, please feel free to ask. The cheat sheet also covers some of that. So you can also look into that if you have any sort of other questions about how some of these concepts work together. Okay, so I'm going to move on now, but if anyone again has any sort of questions or needs to look at how the code works together, we do have a instructor copy, which you can look at, and that should have the same code there for you to look at as well. Okay, so now that we've written our function for get ISS, what we are going to do now is we are going to work on how we're going to represent our latitude and longitude. So if we scroll up all the way to the top, we see that we have this header tag called where the ISS. And where the ISS is actually showing over here when we're running our code. This line is already written for us. And a header tag, what that does is it basically represents this text in kind of like a heading would. So it's sort of like a title that you're going to be using. So here we have where the ISS. And underneath that, we also have a paragraph tag. And paragraph tag, it kind of is basically like what you would think. Paragraph tags you can basically write in text underneath your heading. And in the case of what we're going to do is we're going to write lines for both latitude and for longitude. So the way we'll be doing that is we'll be writing it like this. And let me go ahead and write it. So we're going to say latitude equals. And for this, we're going to, we're actually going to put a colon before that. And we're going to say, for that, we're going to say span ID. And span basically creates a section for you. And we're going to say span ID equals quotation marks LAT for latitude over here. And after that, remember, so tags, the way how tags work is whenever you have an opening tag, you always need to add a closing tag. So if you ever see an open tag, you always want to close that. And what we'll do now is we have our span ID lat. And one thing over here, if you look at the comments, it's really tiny, but there is a degree sign. So let's go ahead and copy that in and put that right after our span. So we have two span, one that says span ID and then our closing tag over here. Right after that closing tag, we're just going to paste in our little degree sign. And maybe I'll put that in the chat just in case anyone needs access to it. Looks like that. Okay. So now that we have our little degree sign, that's going to be the degree of our latitude. And we'll add a little line break. So the reason why we have a line break in this line is because we want to add a line underneath it and we don't want it all going out in one line. So just to make things look a little nicer spacing wise, we're adding a line break. BR is the tag for line break. And we're going to do a very similar process for longitude. The only difference is for span ID, we're going to set it equal to LON for longitude, and we don't need a break. So let me go ahead and type that. So we have longitude colon span ID equals LON. And then the span tag will appear again, and that should be good. Okay. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds to write that down. So the main things you need to know are the span, basically creating those sections in our code. If we see it's already having that, and I see I missed the degree sign, so we need to go ahead and copy that in for longitude. There we go. So now we have, let's run it. There we go. So now we have latitude and longitude, and we have our degree sign, which we had, which we typed down. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to use a method to return the latitude and longitude information. So if we scroll down, there is lines written for us called document.getElements lat.textContent equals latitude and document.getElement by ID lon.textContent equals longitude. So again, what that really does is you use that to return the information that you had in your ID. So if you look over here, your lat and your lon should match up with the span ID. So here we have lat and lon. So make sure that matches up and that the casing is the same and the spelling is the same, because that's what we're going to be calling that ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our code now to see how it is. Let's see if we have any errors. So we have our line over here, and let's check to see if we have any other issues in our function. Get ISS, response data.
Aria, I think
Yeah.
there may be an extra curly brace. Yeah, on that line 55, I think that's superfluous so that you can include that other stuff in the function.
There we go. Thank you, Emilio. Yes, so now we have the data that's being updated. Our latitude and longitude are both updating to reflect the numbers that we need. So that's how it should look like. Again, if you made the same error I did by adding that extra bracket, if you take that out, it should work hopefully. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. But in other words, it should look sort of like this. You have your header, which was already there. You have your latitude and longitude, and then you have the data that's coming in. So I'll give everyone a couple more seconds to do that. And yes, curly braces are really helpful in JavaScript. So here it's really important to make sure your curly braces line up. So if we look over here in my function, I have an outer curly brace and then one that connects over here. And it's really important to make sure that everything sort of connects, because if not, then you might have extra brackets or not enough brackets. So it's just important to make sure that everything is working. And if you ever have these error messages and that's bothering you, you can always clear console. So that fixes.
Sorry, I just want to hop in. You don't get that luxury with other coding languages necessarily. It's nice to be able to just clear errors and ignore them. There will be errors now, but they'll disappear as we fill more and more in. JavaScript's just angry that it's not looking exactly like it wants to quite yet.
Yeah. Yes. Hopefully by the end we shouldn't have any more of those error messages. If we do, then that's another issue that we have to look at. So now we've got this data coming in, which is great. If anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to ask. But if not, we will now be moving on to part 2 of the project, which involves plotting these points on an interactive map using the Leaflet.js library. So we have this reference code. If you see over here, it says link rel style sheet, bunch of code over here, leaflet.css. And what that does is it's basically taking that CSS. CSS stands for cascading style sheets. That has to do with all of the styling information. If you want to, change your font or change the color or add different types of text, that's all done with CSS. And JavaScript is what we're going to be adding some of the functionality to our code with. So this is a reference from Leaflet's JavaScript library. So what we need to do now is we actually should already have an element that says, we should have something that says style right over here. And it should say style ISS map. That's International Space Station map. So what we need to do first is we need to make sure that it has a defined height. So style, we want to change the height of our map that we are going to have. So to do that, we can just hit enter over here, and we're going to say something like height equals, and this comes in pixels, and we're going to make it 180 pixels. So to do that, we just say 180 px, and then make sure to add a semicolon, just like that. So you might be wondering where this ISS map is even coming from. So we have this ISS map over here that's with the hashtag symbol, but if we scroll down a little bit, we can see that there is a line that says div ID. So this is something that we need to add into our code. And what that will do is it will create a section that matches where you want the map to be. And we want it to match with the style code that we wrote on the top. So to do that, what we're going to say is we need to say div with the tag again, and make sure to add a closing tag once you've done that. So div ID equals, and then we want to say ISS map. So it should really just match what you wrote in with the style. So here we have ISS maps, your div should be the same name, ISS map. And after we do that, what we're going to do is add a closing tag, just like that. So now the error should hopefully go away and you should have the div code like that. I'm just going to clean up my code by clicking on the tidy circle. Okay, so now that we have the div and we have the style tag, that should be good. So now we need to create a map itself in JavaScript. So we're going to be taking some code from the Leaflet.js library. It has a really nice guide which shows you how to create the map and how to create the map object. So to do that, what we need to do is go over to the Leaflet website. I'll be sending this the actual code you need, so you can just watch for now. But we need to basically add in a line that looks very similar to this. So I'm going to copy it and put it in the chat. And I'll show you guys exactly where that line needs to go. Okay, so going back to my shell code over here, we're going to be adding this line right where it says, right after this script. So here we're going to have it say, we're going to just paste in the line that we had from earlier, and it says var my map equals L map, blah, blah, blah. So the way how that works is we're going to change it to be from var to const. And then we're going to just capitalize the M in my map just to make sure. So the way how this works, it's called Camel Case. And this is just a naming convention for your variables. So the way how that works is if you have two words, the first word would be lowercase, and in the second word, the first letter would be capital. So here the M in map is capital. So now we have this over here, and we're going to just do a couple of changes. So here we have some things in parentheses. So what does this mean? The first number stands for the latitude, the second one is the longitude, and the third is the zoom level. And this is something we're going to be working with and adding in our project. But what we'll do for now is make these numbers be 0, 0, and 1. So latitude 0, longitude 0, and zoom level is going to be 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how this is looking so far. All right, so what we'll do now is we're going to have to add in tiles. And these tiles are coming from a map called OpenStreetMap. So because we're taking it from an outside source, that's why we have this attribution that says const attribution over here. And this is basically taking it from OpenStreetMap. So we have that, which is good. Now what we need to do is we need to add a line, and I'm pretty sure this is also in the quick start guide, which I can send you guys, or maybe not. Let's see. What we need to do now is we need to say, we need to basically give credit to both the attribution and the tile URL that's over here. So this tile URL is basically all from OpenStreetMap, and it's basically a PNG file that creates the map tiles that we're going to need for the project. So to do that, we are going to go right underneath where it says const tile URL, and just say something like this, const tiles, and we'll set that equal to L dot tile layer, and then inside the parentheses, it's expecting our tile URL, which is a variable over here, as well as the attribution, which is over here. So inside of the parentheses, we want to type in tile URL, comma, our attribution, just like that. Then make sure to add a semicolon. Let's see, I think I'm missing some things here. So what we need to actually do is add in a bracket. Okay. Let's add a bracket in here. And then here is where we'll say attribution. And then we'll need to go over here to where our closing bracket was. Here's where we add the parentheses and then add a semicolon. So
all right,
I think,
could you
yeah.
just pause there for a
Yes,
moment,
sure.
just so that everyone can catch up. I think that was pretty quick.
For sure. So this is the line that we just added. It really takes in these two variables that were there for us. So again, the attribution is just the credit we're giving to OpenStreetMap, and the tile URL is the actual file that generates the tiles that we're going to need for our map.
Also, while we're waiting here, one other thing I noticed is we have that on the const my map l.map, and then the map ID, I believe we should slot in our ISS map so that it's being placed in the right location.
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. So this is important because it needs to, again, match the ID which we had up above. So we created this ISS map, so we're using that same ID in our My Map. So I'll give everyone a little bit to finish out this tiles variable. Yeah, JavaScript is a little picky with a lot of the syntax and notation. So if you make a couple errors like I did, just make sure to check your syntax. Sometimes it's a bracket issue. Sometimes when you're copying it in directly, you forget to change the ID. So just make sure that's working. We have one last important line to add in regarding our tiles, and that's the line that says, hey, how do we add the tiles to the map? And the way we're going to use that, so the L, by the way, I don't know if I explained that earlier, L is because we're directly taking it from the Leaflet library. So these are Leaflet methods that we can use. So that's why we're saying L dot, because it's saying, oh, we're taking it from the Leaflet library. Now that we have the attribution down below and we have our constant tiles, we'll just say tiles, which is the variable that we made over here, dot add to, and we're going to call it my map, and then add a semicolon. And hopefully when we run that, let's see. Okay, interesting. So it's not showing up, but basically what it should happen is the tiles should start coming onto the map. So let me look at the code and see what might be going on. All right. So I can't spot anything for now, but we'll just do one quick run through once we've added in our marker to see what might be going on overall. But we'll just start with adding our marker object. And from there, if we have any persistent errors, we can just look through our code once again and make sure that we can try to figure out what's going on in debug. So what needs to happen is we need to create a leaflet marker object so we can put something on the map at a particular latitude and longitude. So let me just quickly check one more time to see if there's anything going on with the tiles and the attribution to see if there are any sort of small errors which we can detect before we have to add in the marker object. Sorry about that. So what we'll do now is we're going to add a variable called marker. So before we do that, let's go ahead and go over to our leaflet documentation. This is kind of how the marker object looks like. And to create a marker, we're going to use a line of code like this. And I'll send that in the chat real quick. And this is the creation of the marker. And the marker takes in very similar parameters to what the map did. So it takes in latitude and longitude. So what we'll do now is go over to pretty much the beginning of our code, right next to where my map is. And we're going to create a variable for our marker object. We can say const marker equals whatever we just copied down, And again, instead of having the 50.5, 30.5, we'll just make it 0, 0. And make sure to make it my map, which is our variable from earlier. So again, casing really matters here. So make sure that the my map is copied. So the marker should be working. And yes, so now that we have the add to match our my map variable, we're going to need to add a line of code to talk about the marker set view. So if we go over to our Leaflet documentation, what should be happening if this map was showing up is the marker should be at 0, 0. So it should have been right at the center. And what's going on, what we need to do is make it actually be the latitude and longitude when we are updating. So to do that, what we need to do is go over to our documentation, and there's actually a really cool method, and let me see if I can get to it here. It's called setLatLong. Let's see if I can find it. There we go. And that changes the marker position to the given point. So we're going to be using this method over here, setLatLong, and we're going to be using that to update to the current latitude and longitude. So to do that, we'll be going over to our code again. And let me see if I can get there. All right. So this setLatLong, we're going to put that underneath our async function that we created. So it's over here, and where it says update markers location on map, that's where we're going to do marker.setLatLong. So we'll say marker dot setLatLong, and it looks like this. And we're going to have inside latitude, comma, longitude. And one thing to remember is we have these parentheses as usual, but we also have square brackets for where our latitude and longitude are going to be. And after we do that, we are going to, let me make sure this is connected. That should be good, just add a semicolon. And that should be good for the marker. So I'll give you guys a moment to do that. And hopefully by the end, we'll be able to kind of figure out what's going on with updating the map. Let's see. Okay. Right. So one last thing we need to do is we want to set the maps view to be, we want to only set the maps view the first time we run it to represent the location. And we have this variable that's already been created for us. This is called a Boolean variable. So Boolean variables equate to either true or false. So we have let first time equals true, which is already written for us. And we're going to write a really short conditional if statement to basically say that if it's the first time, we want to set the view of the latitude and longitude to a certain zoom level. And then underneath that, we're going to say first time equals false. So that way it doesn't do that any further. So to do that, we're just going to do a really simple if statement. So we'll say if, and then first time, which is the variable up at the top, which has been created for us over here. We'll say if first time, and then we'll do add in our bracket, and inside the brackets, we're going to say my map, and we're going to use dot set view, and I think we did set view earlier, but it's going to be very similar. So we're going to say mymap.setView, and then we'll say latitude, comma, longitude, comma, 2. And then we'll say first time equals false. Okay, and that will basically do it for the conditional. Let me actually check if the set view was there earlier for the map. Maybe that's the issue that was going on from earlier. So we have my map, and we have our marker. Okay, yes, the set view is there. So that's basically all the code we need. I think now what I'm going to do is kind of trace through the code to see what might be the issue and kind of figure out why the map isn't showing up. So this is from the instructor version. So this is basically what you guys should have when you are done. And let me just go through line by line to make sure and see what might be going on from earlier. But how it should be looking like is you should have a map and you should have a certain zoom level over here. And this is the marker that we created from earlier. Right now it's located somewhere in Africa, and you should be able to move this zoom level around. So I'm going to go through everything one more time, just the general overview, because I think there's probably a small error that's causing the whole thing not to show up. So I'll just go through some of the tags again. And if you notice anything in the process when you were making it, feel free to change that line. Here we have our style tag, and then we have our span, and then we have our marker. So this is probably where the error occurred before, but this is the important stuff that you need. So when ISS gets called, it sets the view to the latitude and longitude with the zoom, and then it sets first time to be false. So the next time that runs, it won't keep updating. Otherwise, the zoom level keeps changing, and you don't want that with.
Aria, someone pointed it out. We have an equal sign instead of a colon.
Perfect, thank you. So hopefully that works for the rest of you guys with the equal sign error. Thank you, Julia. So now we have this marker, and if you zoom in a little bit, it should be able to move in real time. So if you see all these countries over here, it takes a little bit to load each time. We set it to 3,000 milliseconds. So for every 3 seconds, that data will update, and then it will basically move little by little. So to wrap up, I'll give you guys just a little bit more time to catch up. Thank you again, Julia, for catching that error. JavaScript is picky, so thank you so much for catching that again. And we'll be sending this, the shell code and the completed code should be accessible to you guys. So you can do this over again. You can add in things with the JavaScript and Leaflet libraries. And there's going to be an exit survey email to you. So it'd be super helpful to fill that out just so we can get feedback about the event and plan out any upcoming workshops. We have some really cool topics, like Emilio said, about machine learning and agent-based modeling. So we're going to be doing some of those workshops this semester. And we'll be sending a recording that's linked to our YouTube channel. So that YouTube channel pretty much has all of our past events and events coming up. So you can check out some of those events. So thank you guys so much for attending.